All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you are, for this recording. I am Meg Beyer. I am an adjunct faculty member at Touro College's School of Social Work, and I'm joined by two exceptional social workers and social workers in training in the field in New York City. We are going to hear from our two colleagues, who I'll introduce in a moment, about their work on the Social Workers Against Solitary Confinement campaign. Sandy Burnaby is going to introduce herself in a moment, and so will Margarita Johnson-Tolson. I'm really excited to have them share their experience and opportunity for our students to partake in this work. And I'm really even more excited for our students to be able to hear from our voices in the field, social workers doing great work out in the field. So with that, I would like to ask Sandy and Margarita to introduce themselves.
Meg, thank you so much for doing this. The topic today is social workers against solitary confinement and the work that we engage in, which is undoing racism. And today we'll talk about the criminal justice system, and yesterday we were talking about the child welfare system, and tomorrow we can talk about policing or healthcare, and it doesn't matter what system. Undoing racism and the issue of racism is what is bringing us all together in common cause and common language. Yeah, I've been a social worker for 36 years, so I'm not the one who's the intern. Margarita is our intern. Yeah, I've been a social worker for 35 years, and I've worked in practically every field that has to do with children and families. That was my commitment, and an addiction specialist. And when I was brought into the undoing racism work when we were repealing the Rockefeller drug laws, because it was so blatantly racist. It was so blatantly, disproportionately targeting communities of color. And at that time, I was working at the Rockland Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. I was the executive director there, and Phyllis Frank from Volunteer Counseling Service came over and she said, "Sandy, give me $250 and 2.5 days of your life. If you take this Undoing Racism workshop, it'll just turn everything upside down." So with that, and out of my respect and trust for her, I did an Undoing Racism workshop. And myself and other social workers who sat through that workshop were really baffled. We were baffled that we had graduated from the finest schools of social work and had not received an anti-racist education. And we didn't really understand. I mean, how many people have heard we're a race-constructed society? Like, you've heard that, right?
Absolutely.
But we've not been really educated about what that means. And it was the Undoing Racism workshop that helped me to understand that a race-constructed society has a history that is accumulative and disadvantaging certain race groups. And it's not just historic, it's current day as well. And how social workers really are engaged in all systems. And so we are either enablers in all systems, or we can be working for transformation in all systems. And so we decided that we would call upon the profession of social work to be the first discipline to demand that its professionals, even at the highest degree, understand racism, what it is, the impact that it has on the citizenry, and that what we're really working towards is to be sure that anybody who works with human beings understands racism and its impact, because it impacts every single system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just want Margarita to have a chance to introduce herself. Yes?
Yeah. Hi, Meg. I thank you so much for having me. I'm highly delighted to be here. And I'm a returning citizen. I came back home in 1997. My name is Margarita. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Nice meeting you. I'm here to really talk about the solitary confinement. And like Sandy said before, undoing racism, no matter what system you're working in, undoing racism covers all. It supersedes everything. My main focus today is the mental illness that solitary confinement causes when you are behind them bars. I went into jail as a person with a mental illness, not knowing that I had a mental illness. I didn't care to know, because whatever I was doing suited me. So I didn't care who else it would suit. However, I went into jail. I knew what solitary confinement was. I've seen people that I knew for years in the street was calling my name because they know me. I just couldn't answer back or, stop by the cells to say anything. Honestly, I was afraid. I was afraid because if I did retaliated to them, I would have been thrown into solitary confinement. With somebody who's claustrophobic like me, I don't think I would made it for the first 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And that really hurted me, and it caused my mental illness to get even worse. Mm-hmm. When I went to the doctor one morning, he said, well, we're going to have to put you on medication. He didn't tell me anything about a psychiatrist or anything. They just wanted to put me on a medication. When I see how people that was taking medication, how they was zombied out. They was walking and hardly can walk. They gained weight in a week. They was 200 pounds heavier. I was very afraid. And I said, you know what? Thank God I didn't get that much of a time. So I'm going to tough this out. I toughed this out with crying every day in my room, trying to read, and I couldn't read everything. I read one page 50 times because I just want to come home and take care of myself. In coming home and taking care of myself, and I told the doctor the medication that they wanted to give me. He said, oh my God, it's like they want to shoot an elephant. They trying to kill an elephant. I'm like, the medication was way too strong. And the doctor wanted to prescribe me medication. I say, how about me seeing a therapist for a little while? At that time, I was really an accountant. And that's what brought me close to social work, because you have to think about the people that you're surrounded with, the culture and people of color and the minorities. And we are the one that suffer with these things. And we don't seem to pay enough attention. We made to believe that it's resources that make us poor, but it's the lack of power. When you don't have power, we learn a lot more of that in Undoing Racism when Sandy gets into that. But I'm here to answer any questions you have on solitary confinement. I'd like to end on this note that I know that solitary confinement causes mental illness. And I know that the people that's stricken by mental illness who had it before and go back into solitary confinement, can you imagine what's happening with these people? That's like a second dose around. That's like having one dose and going in, and then you come out, you go in one way, you come out another way. And then when you got to come into society, you becomes afraid. You see people and you want to hide. I know that because I've been there. I was afraid to tell people I went to jail because we had this ex-convict. Even our language has changed since then. Now we're returning citizen. Returning, we could be coming from Paris, we could be coming from Rome, but we are returning citizen. Mm-hmm. So the language has changed. Right. So on that note, take it away, Sandy.
Margarita, your story is replicated over and over and over again. Yes. And how often do we see people who look like you, exonerated after spending so many years? I mean, there's no doubt about it that we need to take a look at the intersection of race and the criminal justice system. But this whole idea is how do we find ourselves working in communities, poor communities, disproportionately communities of color? And no matter what we do, we find that we're not able to really get the outcomes that we want. And I just want to go back to this idea of it's a race-constructed society. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, we really don't know what that means. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about that. What we don't fully appreciate is that the founding fathers and mothers of our nation, they came here from England to escape their own oppression, right? They came here to build a nation for themselves, for themselves and their families. And by the time the Constitution was written, well, actually in 1776, right, when the Declaration was declared, when they signed the Declaration, every single system was already in place. The systems of education, transportation, health, the library systems, all the systems were already in place because they brought this knowledge right from England.
Mm-hmm.
The Declaration of Independence was 1776, but the Constitution was 1787. And the Constitution is the governing laws of the land.
Mm-hmm.
When they came here, they understood that in order to build a strong country for themselves, they needed free land and they needed free labor. And so we know our history, right, about the enslavement of the Africans and
Mm-hmm.
the extinguishing of the Native Americans. But in our Constitution, in the first article, the second paragraph, the idea of maintaining power for those founding mothers and fathers was so primary that that 3/5 clause was put in.
Mm-hmm.
And the 3/5 clause, right,
Mm-hmm.
that for the purpose of representation, they needed to make a correction for the fact that in the South, there were more enslaved Africans than there would be white free men.
Mm-hmm.
There would be more power in the North. So in order to create that balance, they said that Native Americans would not be counted at all, which tells us what their intention was. But the enslaved Africans would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation.
That's right.
Now, that 3/5 has dehumanized a certain group of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the Constitution. The Constitution are the guiding laws and principles for the entire nation. And that bias, that pro-white bias, that 3/5 clause baked into our Constitution, baked into each and every institution that has been established.
Mm.
And it was almost as if you've baked something, you put in too many eggs, and afterwards, it's a hell of a job to try to get it out.
That's right.
Since then, we have been trying the Civil Rights Act, on and on and on, trying to make it right, because we realize, and Joyce James has coined this term, that racism exists, structural racism exists at the groundwater level in our country. At the groundwater level, written in the Constitution, baked into every institution, and it will seep up into every single institution and deliver disproportionate impacts for people of color. Whites will fare better in every institution, bar none, because of the social arrangement, because of the way organizations and institutions are structured in this country. And when we are clear about that, we're no longer baffled about the outcomes that we see. We understand that it was intentional at the inception of our nation, and these outcomes are by design. If we want to remediate for that, if we want to have equity, then we really need to own it, number one, and to understand that we need to put our decision-making and our actions through a process of undoing this. Otherwise, no matter what our good intentions are, the outcomes will disproportionately harm people who look like you, Margarita, people who look like Megan and myself. Now, social work is came to help and not harm.
That's right.
But if we don't understand this, we will become a profession, we have become a profession of enablers. Because unwittingly, by doing good work, designed by white people, for white people, textbooks written by white people, theories developed by white people, schools educating us from white paradigms, that we will all be socialized into this normative and begin to, and everybody is socialized into the same system. So people of color and white people, all educated, all part of this. And so undoing racism really is about understanding our history and actually being intentional and deliberate to make sure that we are accountable for different outcomes. If we want different outcomes, we need to do things differently.
Exactly. And we got to, and that note, Sandy, we have to also be willing to accept each other's differences. And that's why in learning with undoing racism and solitary confinement, I am so happy to be here, because I never really sit and think about the principles until I came around you that teaches the principles of undoing racism.
That's
And
right.
it builds in with culture and all the just like 10 different principles. And that's all it takes. Those are the history of undoing racism.
The People's Institute for Survival and Beyond for the past 40 years has been providing education through this Undoing Racism workshop. And becoming anti-racist is not about good intentions. It's about living by anti-racist principles, to understand our history, to understand culture, to understand, you know, gatekeeping, to understand, right?
Do a loyalty.
Inferiority, yeah.
Yes.
And once we have this understanding, we move it away from the personal, and we understand that it isn't about me and my good intentions.
No.
It really is about me being accountable to learn. So whenever we're talking about any situation, we want to have whatever the data is, and we have to ask for data and say, would you please disaggregate that data by race? Because, you know, you can say that unemployment is 4% in this country or 6% in this country, but when you say, please disaggregate that by race, you'll see that Black men are disproportionately unemployed, and that those rates are 10, 20, 30 times, right? Like in New York City, the unemployment rate for Black men is near 50%.
That's right.
You don't know that until you disaggregate by race. Okay, so let's talk about how race plays out in solitary.
Thank you for setting the stage with that, Sandy. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Enough. Is there anything else I should say, Meg?
No, I think you got it. That's great. And as a graduate of the People's Institute's workshop, I would love if any students want to talk about this in class. I'd love to talk about my experience taking the workshop when I was a student.
Please tell me. What were you going to say, Meg?
Oh, no. All I was going to say was when my students watch this video, if they're interested in taking the workshop, I would love to discuss this with them and my experience and how it kind of changed my world as a social worker today.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, like every month we host an Undoing Racism workshop, and we even have an Undoing Racism internship project where students, you know, do an internship. Margarita is a student, and through NASW we have 3 or 4 students from the different schools. But you can go to the antiracistalliance.com, and that's where we archive our work, and that's where we list the workshops.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I just want to talk about the link between race and solitary confinement. And I found this article that was in The Atlantic, and it says men of color overrepresented in isolation, while whites are typically underrepresented. And it's just staggering. Now we have to really remember this. In this country, the Black population is 13%. So when you disaggregate any data, you will see over and over and over, 13% of the population is overrepresented in systems that harm. Whites being, you know, 80% of the population, 75% of the population will be underrepresented all the time. So in this article, they say that they looked at 43 jurisdictions of prisons. And they said that Black male prisoners made up 40% of the total prison population, right? And constituted 45% of the people in restricted housing, which is solitary confinement. So how do you have 13% of the population filling almost 50% of 43 prisons that were mentioned in this study, but almost 45% of those in solitary? It makes you kind of wonder, why are Black people so overrepresented in solitary? And they also said that they would look at, they said that they spent more time in solitary when they compared them to their white cohorts, right? In the District of Columbia, which was the most egregious, whites represented 2% of both the general population and solitary, and Blacks in the District of Columbia represented 94% of the people in the general population and in solitary. That is insane. In California, Latinos make up 40% of the general population and 86% of the people in solitary confinement. On and on and on. Okay, here's the problem. Now, whether we're talking about the fact that kindergartners in our country, Black young boys who are in kindergarten, are expelled at high rates when compared to whites for the same behavior. Okay, we're talking about expelling a kindergartner. And it's because the teacher, well-intended educators, are looking at behavior and seeing violence. Implicit bias, they're actually perceived violence. And so it's about people who are well-intended not having an analysis that we're talking about, understanding the embedded bias, and actually perceiving. And this is the same in child welfare, right? In child welfare, a caseworker will go to a Black poor family and see that this is not a safe situation. But they will not see the same thing when they go to a white family. They will see this is a poor family.
Exactly.
And I want to say, I mean, I've been in practice for 36 years, and I do addiction treatment. I work with a lot of white families. They didn't have their children removed. They went into treatment.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And I want you to think about the opioid epidemic now. They're not having their children removed at huge numbers.
No, they're not.
Right? But when you say, why are Black children being removed? They'll say drugs. And that is the criteria for safety. Okay. It is the perception of white caseworkers or caseworkers who have been socialized in the system and then don't have those perceptions examined that will perceive violence in one situation and will perceive poverty in another.
Exactly.
And that's happening in criminal justice. Minority officers may be more likely to be perceived. I mean, minority offenders may be more likely to be perceived as a disciplinary threat by correctional officers, regardless of the offender's actual behavior. Okay, so this is, we need to take this. This is staggering. In New York State, and that's what we're talking, 85% of the 30,000 strong correctional staff is white.
Yes.
85% white. 25% are Latino, and 11% is Black. And Margarita, let me ask you something just with the impression. When you were inside, what percentage do you think were people of color?
Majority, I would say like 75% of the people were people of color.
Then
Hispanic and,
Black,
together.
Exactly. So if that's the case, you would hope that proportionately that would be represented in the correctional staff, but that's not.
Exactly. And Sandy, I wanted to fill in a spot where you talk about the child welfare. They even judge the children by their zip code, by the zip code in which they live, and how can you judge a child by their zip code?
Right. Well, Joyce James, who's a leader in child welfare and really has led the charge in reducing racial disproportionality, would say in the state of Texas, when they were called into a particular neighborhood, they didn't even question it. They just put the car seat in the back seat because they knew that a removal was going to happen.
Exactly.
Those zip codes that you're talking about are zip codes of color, communities of color. Yet, if they were going out to a white family, they didn't put the car seat in the back.
In the back of the car.
This was unconscious behavior, and it wasn't until they started to turn the mirror inward and take a look at their own actions and their own behaviors and their own outcomes were they able to make a huge difference in the lives of children and families. And the work that they did there, they showed that when they engaged in the work of eliminating racial disproportionality for children, all families, including white families, benefited. So what we're talking about here is racism has dehumanized us. And the work of undoing racism is to restore that humanity.
Of course.
I just, last night I was reading Michelle Obama quotes, and she said that she wants to, at one point she said, please look at me and look at my husband and look at my children and get to know us and don't be afraid of us. Yes. We represent other families, And she was saying, take a look at your own attitudes. We need to change the perceptions that we have. And if we don't, and we just do business as usual, we will become enablers into the system that creates great harm. And over and over and over, they'll say that ambiguous disciplinary rules, particularly regulating the inmates' attitudes, are especially susceptible to the influence by an individual prison's guard implicit racial preferences. We actually see things differently. So let's go on. I'm just wondering if we might be able to watch Johnny Perez's video.
Absolutely. Let me cue that up. So I'm going to share my screen. So bear with me a moment while I do so. See here. Okay.
There's our website, Social Workers Against Solitary Confinement.
Wonderful. And for students, I will be posting a link to this website so you can visit it and look at all the resources and information that's there.
And the videos that we're watching today are in fact on that website. So
yes,
here
we
are.
Johnny Perez. Exactly. So let's watch this right here. Okay.
I'm not seeing me.
Here, so I think our images disappear when I'm sharing the screen, just momentarily.
Oh, okay.
We'll be back. Don't worry. All right, here we go with the video. I'm going to make it full screen.
Thank you.
Okay. My name is Johnny Perez. I am a safe reentry advocate at the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project. And my role is that I connect people who are returning back into society from jails, hospitals, and prisons with services in society in order to help them reach the best measures of recovery. For myself, how I came into the work is that I served 13 years in prison, 3 of those years in solitary confinement. Today, what I would like to do is to talk to you specifically about solitary confinement. If you've never been in solitary confinement, you'll be surprised to know that the cell is very small, sort of like the size of two Walmart spaces placed together. It's so small that I used to stretch both of my hands out and touch both walls. In the summer, it gets real hot, so hot that you can actually just feel the walls sweat. It gets so cold in the wintertime that it makes it very difficult to sleep. And it gets quiet, so quiet that you can hear your own heartbeat. And sometimes it also gets so loud from the cacophony of different voices of other people who are yelling, screaming, crying inside of their cells that it actually drives people crazy, for lack of a better term. Some of the psychological effects that I encountered while I was placed in isolation for such a long time was just basically an increased sense of anger and hopelessness. I found myself crying a lot. I found myself punching walls. I found myself doing extraneous jumping jacks and push-ups and just writing my anger out. One of the difficult things about solitary confinement is that there's little to no meaningful human contact. And for me, the only person who I came in contact with was the correction officer who served me food, through the slat in the metal door inside of my cell. The first meal is at 7 o'clock. The next meal is at 12 in the afternoon. And the last meal is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If you hold your food anytime after that and the cell search comes, then you can be found guilty for being in possession of contraband, which in turn can lead to more solitary time. And this is important because this is the reason why someone can go into solitary for 90 days and end up in solitary for years, if not decades at a time. I mean, we live in a country where Alfred Woodbach spent 42 years inside of a cell. I'm 37 now. We also live in a country where the criminal age of responsibility is 16 years old in New York and North Carolina, 2 of the last states in our country. And what that means is that we can place 16-year-olds not only in solitary, but also in adult prisons and subject them to this inhumane treatment. People should know that while in solitary, there's little to no meaningful intellectual stimulation. I found myself, trying to just read anything, the back of toothpaste, or just reading my own writings that I decided to write. And when I didn't have anything to read, I found myself counting the bricks on the wall. I found myself thinking about the past a lot. I thought about the future a lot. I found myself dreaming and thinking about alternate endings to a future that I had yet to encounter. 10 months later, when they opened the cell and I went back to solitary confinement into general population, I found myself being an introvert, where before I was more of an extrovert. I used to like to laugh and joke and, just kind of get along with people, except that when I came out, solitary took some of that away from me. I found people hard to trust. I found myself laughing and smiling at things that I used to laugh and smile about. My appetite changed. I lost a lot of weight while I was in solitary. I remember going in weighing 155 and coming out weighing about 130, 140 pounds. When it comes to coming out of solitary, it's not as easy or straightforward as people might think. First, you should know that there is no due process to even get into solitary in the first place. You can't cross-examine any evidence that placed you in solitary in the first place. And you also find it hard to present witnesses. In prison, you have to give the first and last name of a person who's a witness, except that everyone in prison usually goes by a nickname, therefore making it difficult for you to even have someone as a witness during your hearing. People should also know that translators are very difficult to find in the correctional setting. For this reason, people who have English as a second language actually find themselves more often than not on the receiving end of solitary. And also, contrary to popular belief, people might think that it's only the most violent and the most aggressive who are in solitary, and that is absolutely not true. 4 out of 5 offenses are completely minor offenses, committed by people who are then placed in solitary. And these minor offenses can be very simple, like, shooting spitballs at a correctional officer, or talking back, or refusing what's called a direct order, where you find yourself on the receiving end of this torture. Right now, there are groups in New York City and around the nation who are working on this issue, specifically in a group that I am a part of also called the Campaign for Alternatives to Long-Term Isolated Confinement. And we have a piece of legislation which is going to radically change the way that we even use solitary confinement in New York State. And it's called the HALT Act. HALT, for the Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Isolated Confinement. And it seeks to reduce solitary in 3 distinct ways. Number 1, it limits who can be placed in solitary in the first place. So not only the 16-year-olds that I told you about earlier, but also women who are expecting children who here in New York State will be placed in solitary. Also, people who are developmentally disabled, people who are severely mentally ill, and also people who identify with the LGBTQ community, who once they, expose their lifestyle to in correctional settings, they're actually placed at a higher likelihood of being placed in solitary, and also at a high likelihood of being victimized by the general population. So we really don't want these people in solitary. And more importantly, the second provision of the bill is that it limits the amount of days in which people can spend in solitary in the first place, which brings it in line with world views around torture, specifically the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, the former Juan Mendez, who deemed anything over 15 days to be considered torture. But here in New York and in our country, we place people for days, months, years, even decades at a time. So we really want to limit the amount of days that people spend in solitary to 15 days. And then lastly, we have to ask a question about what kind of society do we want to be? We're very grateful to be able to collaborate and partner with other, organizations and other groups, specifically NERCAT, the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, who has done a lot of work to advance and raise awareness about the inhumane use of solitary confinement. And also the Social Workers Against Solitary Confinement, which, they really recognize and really value, not only the being able to bring, services to the people who are currently incarcerated, but also just to stop the inhumane use of solitary, and just to stop of torture altogether. Again, my name is Johnny Perez, Safe Reentry Advocate at the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project, and I am a survivor of solitary. Thank you.
Go, Johnny.
Wow, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to bring us out of the shared mode and back into our screen mode. Give me 1 second. All right, there we are.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Really give us pause what he said, huh?
Yeah.
People we believe that people go into solitary for they're violent, right? Or they're in such danger, whatever. But if 80 to 100,000 people in the United States are going into solitary each year, is it possible that we have 80 to 100,000 violent people? I mean, if that's the case, then we really got to take a look at this nation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But no, that's a myth.
That's right.
And that just keeps those throwaway people out of sight, out of mind. That they are the worst of the worst. These are murderers, rapists, thugs, all those horrible things that we hear. And it's not true. Johnny's in there for, spitballs or
13 years, yeah. With spitball.
Ridiculous, right? There's a term that I learned about when I started working with solitary confinement. It's called iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis, and it says it's a Greek word meaning brought forth by the healer. And it really speaks to, here it is, iatrogenesis refers to adverse effects, possibly including broadly all adverse, unforeseen outcomes resulting from medications or other interventions. And we say that not only is prison a negative iatrogenic effect or impact, but solitary itself creates mental illness in and of itself. Clearly, the United Nations said that after 15 days. But how many of us would maintain our sanity if we were put into that condition, and particularly if it was an unjust reason. If you're in there and you really didn't do anything, I mean, we know from the experience of Kalief Browder, all Kalief did, he's a 16-year-old in New York City, Rikers, not even convicted of a crime and pending, and for 3 years, spent time at Rikers, going in and out of solitary, because he kept saying, I didn't do it. I didn't do it.
Yes.
They had him there because they said that he stole somebody's
bag. Yeah.
And after 3 years of going in and out of solitary, and still he said, I didn't do it. Finally, a judge said, why is this boy here? Why is he here for 3 years? Well, because the mechanism is like certain things will happen and then the time clock stops and then the time clock. So he served 3 years. She finally said, the mother can't afford $3,000 bail and this young man is going through this, let him out. And we know what happened to Kalief Browder. When he came out, he had been so damaged, right? He'd been so damaged that he took his own life.
Yes.
And the New York State HALT Act and a lot of the organizing, Kalief is listed as one of the most egregious, the most unjust experiences of incarceration and solitary confinement, and really sparked the movement to close at Rikers.
Yes.
And Sandy, can I add something, if it's okay?
Sure.
So my hope is that at this point, my students have actually read the Kalief Browder piece in the New Yorker. So I've shared it with them as part of the component for this class session. And I really hope that we can kind of have some rich in-person discussions in class around this that they're viewing today, what you and Margarita are sharing, the Kalief Browder article, and also the importance of some of the policies that are in place today that need to change, which is what we're talking about right now. So thank you for bringing that up.
No, and thank you. I forgot that you did have that as required.
As one of our,
There's also the Kalief Browder documentary, which has incredible clips. But it brought us to people like Mary Buser, who is a social worker in Brooklyn, who we're going to watch a video in a few minutes, who reached the point of being, the commissioner of mental health and in charge of overlooking solitary confinement and the decisions. Anyway, we became very concerned about the whole issue, that there is a conflict here. Social workers who came to help and not harm, being put in a position, their employment position, kind of like handcuffed. This tension between, and just quote how we define dual loyalty, is the tension between protecting patients from harm and participating in punishment. And it's a clear ethical dilemma for medical and mental health providers. In the state of Tennessee, if a pregnant woman is arrested, and this is hard to believe, for her protection, she's put into solitary.
Yeah.
But wait, you've got a pregnant woman in solitary for her protection, and if she's poor, she can languish there for a very long time before her day in court arrives. Exactly. And that happens here too. You heard Johnny mention the LGBTQ community very often, for their own protection, will go into solitary.
Exactly.
The mental health community in a real bind. Are we protecting or are we harming? How can solitary confinement actually protect when it's
That's
harm.
common. Yeah.
It's the dual loyalty.
Yes.
And so Mary Buser and, we have these monthly calls, and professionals from all over the country who participate in solitary decision-making, or did, because many of them refused to and have decided to leave before they would continue, have become advocates to end solitary as we know it. There has got to be, we're the only nation that does this.
That does this, exactly.
No other nation does this to its
Nobody else.
its citizenry. There has to be a humane alternative to create safety, to create segregation. Where people are punished, there needs to be guidelines about who gets punished and who doesn't get punished. There was a huge study in Texas just around school discipline, and they studied, and they did a longitudinal study, 8th grade to 12th grade in the state of Texas over like 10 years, and they looked at discipline. And after they, removed all factors, they factored out this, they factored out that, and they said that race was the one factor that would determine whether a teacher or a disciplinarian at the school would see, once again, they would see a particular behavior as violent, rule breaking, but they would see the same behavior in another group as being kids will be kids, boys will act that way. They realized that they could not leave the disciplinary decision to the individual because implicit bias kept playing itself out and punishing harshly kids of color. And so they started to have criteria that you cannot discipline, you cannot expel, but this is the criteria for this action, this is the criteria for this action. And they started to reduce the numbers of kids of color that were being expelled or isolated, taken out. They needed criteria, but we don't have that in solitary. In the corrections world, I hate to use this expression, they say if they're pissed off at you, they can just put you in solitary. And while you're in solitary and you're starting to, complain, they keep ticketing you. They're called tickets, and those tickets.
Tickets keep rolling in.
Right. And what we're also saying is that there might be reasons why people need to be in segregated housing, but we also need to have strict guidelines.
Yes.
What is the behavior that, then you have the other,
then
you have the other problem, right, Margarita? There's no watch fly.
Yes, exactly.
Like he said, there's no place to report the violence. Right. Okay, so I think if, this whole thing about, talking about ethics, and do we take a stand for our professional ethics, or do we, because very often social workers are in host agencies, do we compromise our own ethics in order to maintain our positions in our host agencies? And whether that's in prisons or whether that's in schools or hospitals, they have their own code of ethics, they have their own standards. And when we are in conflict, what do we do? Do we take a stand based on our ethics? Or do we compromise those in order to maintain the position and follow through the policies of the institutions where we're working? And we're hoping that because we are found in all human systems, that the social work professional ethics would be the higher ethics that we would guide, the guiding principles for our actions and behavior.
Absolutely.
And treating everyone equal with worth. We are all of worth.
And to measure that, how do we measure that everybody's being treated for worth? It's a lofty idea, but because of this groundwater, we need to be accountable with data. And we'll know that everybody's treated with worth. We'll know that everybody is treated with worth when we ask this question. Can you tell me what the racial outcomes are for segregated housing or solitary? And we say, no.
Yeah.
You have to look at the data. But right now, you can ask anybody who lives in this country, what are the outcomes for discrimination in housing? Boom, we know that. What are the outcomes? What are the outcomes, race-based outcomes for high school graduation? Boom, we know that. And even if we don't know the data, we understand at the end of the day. We will know that everyone is treated with fairness, with dignity and integrity. When we honestly can't answer that question, we'll have to look at the data.
Yes.
Then we know that we've been accountable. Yeah. Okay, anything? Should we go on to Mary Buser?
Sure. Yeah, this is great.
Mary Buser does her own introductions. We can't do it any better.
Yeah, sure.
All right, then I will take us. Let me share my screen one more time.
Okay.
And we will watch the Mary video. All right. Let me pull us over here.
These are sheroes and heroes in our profession.
That's right.
Oh, yes.
Exactly. Okay, so let's see.
My name is Mary Buser. I'm a social worker, and I wrote the book Lockdown on Rikers, which is about my experience working in the mental health department at New York City's Rikers Island. It is the story of my journey from idealistic intern all the way to assistant chief of mental health in the 500-cell solitary confinement unit. And it's this issue of solitary confinement that I would like to discuss in this video. And in particular, I would like to focus on the role of mental health professionals who work in these units. But first, just what is solitary confinement? Well, most people have some sense of it from movies about jails and prisons. We hear it go by the slang names of the shoe, the box, the hole. It has official names such as punitive segregation, special housing. But regardless of what you call it, it all comes down to the same thing, which is confinement to a cell about the size of a parking space for 23 hours a day. There is no meaningful human contact. Food trays are passed through a flap in the cell door. The reason someone is placed in solitary is usually, not always, but usually, as punishment for an infraction ranging from disobeying orders to assault on staff. The length of time someone spends in here also ranges from a few days to decades. So what do mental health professionals do in these units? Well, first and foremost, solitary confinement is a psychological punishment, and it is a grueling punishment. So much so that our mental health team had to monitor the people inside these cells for mental deterioration and especially for suicidal behavior. We had a saying at Rikers, if they have no mental health issues before they entered solitary, they do now. And as such, we dispensed mountains of psychiatric medication, antipsychotics, antidepressants, sleeping pills, you name it. And I remember when I first started working in this unit, asking myself, what kind of a punishment is this that
Oops, let's see. Sorry about that pause.
people need to be medicated in order to endure it? But it turned out that for us, dispensing medication was actually the easy. It was what happened when these meds could no longer hold a human psyche together, when the rigors of isolation resulted in self-mutilation and suicide attempts, that we would be called to a cell door. And I have to tell you that it was grim. I witnessed people covered in blood, covered in excrement. I saw people banging their heads against the cinder block walls incessantly. I saw bare skulls, incoherent babbling, makeshift nooses, agonized shell-shocked faces begging us for some relief from this extreme suffering. And in fact, the mental health department had the authority to issue a temporary reprieve, but only in cases where we felt that someone was at a very high risk of death. And even then, we were under fierce pressure not to let people out. The reason being that this was the punishment and people were expected to endure it. But we were also to be sure that no one actually died. One warden said to me, I need a strong mental health team in here. I do not want to call at 4 o'clock in the morning that someone is hanging for real. So this shows us just how grueling solitary confinement is. And it also shows just how intertwined a mental health team is in carrying out this practice. So what did we do in these cases? Well, we would try to talk to the person, we would gauge the cuts, the gashes, we would huddle to the side of the cell and try to make a decision. Could we increase the medication, change the medication? Could they hang on for a few more days? Or was it likely that in the morning they could be dead? And as we struggled with these decisions, I often had the sense that far from that idealistic intern that I had once been who wanted to help people, I was now essentially a monitor of human suffering. We all were. But I brushed these thoughts from my mind, telling myself that this could not be as bad as it seems. Why not? Because this is the United States, and we are a country that is progressive on human rights. The American flag is flying above the jail. Across the country, mental health workers are doing the exact same thing that we were doing because solitary confinement is standard punishment throughout the country. But I continued to have doubts and misgivings, especially when I heard an interesting story about Senator John McCain, who was famously held as a POW in Vietnam. For 5 years, McCain was tortured. He was beaten, his bones were broken, and he suffered unspeakable treatment as a POW. But he had this to say about his captivity afterwards. He said that of everything that he endured, the worst of it was solitary confinement. We are outraged by the treatment that John McCain suffered in Vietnam, and yet somehow we don't connect that to the exact same treatment that is meted out through our jails and prisons here in the United States, where 80 to 100,000 people are currently held in solitary confinement. It seems to me that as a country that prides itself on human rights, we have lost our way. In 2011, the United Nations declared that solitary confinement beyond 15 days constitutes torture. So we're now hearing that word officially. More recently, in 2016, President Obama called for reforms to solitary confinement and abolished it for juveniles in the federal prison system. So we're starting to see this punishment that has been hidden in the recesses of jails and prisons coming out into the light of the public square and being questioned. And I'm wondering if mental health professionals shouldn't also be questioning our participation in this and asking ourselves if we haven't also lost our way. If mental health professionals did not participate in solitary confinement or place limits on our involvement, reform would be inevitable and it would be swift. There are those who say that solitary is necessary to keep jails and prisons safe, but I would argue that that is a myth, that other countries manage to achieve safety without resorting to solitary confinement. So can we.
Yes.
If nothing else, it is time for mental health professionals to stand by our code of ethics, because solitary confinement in its current form is no place for the helping professions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Buser.
Yeah, Mary Buser put that down.
Right. She
That's
took
right.
that down.
Yeah.
She took
Okay.
that down. You know, every month on the third Monday of each month,
Yes.
7 p.m., we hold a conference call. It's a national networking conference call. And Mary Buser and others like Mary Buser, Margarita, myself, we talk about what we're going to do. What is our contribution? And so we decided that we would, in fact, make these 2 videos, reach out to schools, and we thank Toro for accepting our, to have this time. And we hope that this video is used by others, that we make it public. But we decided that one of the things that we were going to do is to write to the National Commission on Correctional Health Care, which is the governing body of these standards, these decisions that are made about what's going to happen in prisons. And 41 organizations are reflected in this body. And NASW is one of those organizations.
Wow. Okay.
And Mel Wilson is the representative from NASW at the national level who is at this National Commission on Correctional Health. And so we drafted a petition, and we said that we would go about doing these presentations, reaching out to social workers, having them explore the ethics of our engagement. You know, we're here for human dignity, we're here to protect and not harm. The ethics of our involvement, as well as doctors, psychiatrists, and nurses. Okay, and so we formed this task force, Social Workers Against Solitary Confinement. We have a petition. We're going to ask you to sign the petition, but I just want to read the heart and soul of this petition so that it's documented here in this video. We, undersigned, helping and health professionals, question the ethics of health workers' participation in the practice of solitary confinement. In particular, mental health professionals play a vital role in this practice as they are routinely called upon to assess the mental status of those held in solitary, to provide psychiatric medication, and to advise correctional personnel as to those at high risk for suicide. Ironically, solitary confinement itself creates and exacerbates mental disorders, yet we are forced to become enablers to this grueling punishment. We call upon the governing bodies of our profession to set mandatory standards for those assigned to these units and to denounce solitary confinement in its current form, as it is in direct violation of our code of ethics, which calls upon each of us to uphold the dignity and the humanity of all people. And so we're asking everybody to go to the following website and sign this petition: www.end-solitary.com, end-solitary.com. Sign this petition, and we're going to bring it to the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare and NASW. And we want the schools of social work to include in their, criminal justice curriculums that are beginning to develop. Why? Because social workers are now working in criminal justice. We want this piece. We are a mighty force. We are a mighty force. There's 121,000 of us all over this country. And if we decide that we are not going to participate, and we are going to partner with the Psychological Association, with the Medical Association, with the Nurses Association, we're saying, you know what, do your own dirty work. If you want to put somebody in solitary, you do it. But don't ask us, who've taken an oath to come to help heal and participate in this torture. We take a stand. We do not want to participate. So that's where we stand with solitary confinement. But once you become an anti-racist, you take a stand in child welfare. No, not remove children until we make sure that this is a safety issue and not a racial bias issue.
Right.
We will no longer remove children simply because the parents are doing drugs. White people do drugs all the time.
Yes.
On and on and on. We need to develop the conviction, the courage, the fluency, the understanding that it's at the ground level. Social workers are in all human systems. Racism is in all human
systems.
Right? Margarita, the historical accumulation and the current day discrimination, resulting in disparate impacts that are harming. And here we are getting jobs to deliver services, but never to go to the what and the why behind what we
do. The source.
That's right. And if we don't get to the root cause and understand the what and the why behind what we will be a profession of enablers. Oh, Lord, the time has come for us to be bold and to take leadership. And I want
to stand up.
I want to lift the millennials.
Yes.
The millennials are saying, oh, I don't think so. No, we're not going to do that anymore. I'd rather not work here than to do that. You know, if we're not treated, they're not treated. The millennials are the future of our profession, of our country. And I want to lift and support that work.
That's
right. They have a critical eye. And they're saying, we will not just follow the leader. You've led us down the pathway to hell. And we're not going to follow anymore. We're going to lift the millennials, right?
Yes.
And we're going to support them in bringing integrity to our profession and some humanity to this country. And I don't know what more I can say other than
That's why we become social workers.
Yeah.
That's what social workers do.
That's great.
Give me that left hand.
Where's your hand? Where's your hand?
Raise your hands, everybody. Yes.
We have to do this. If it's not us, who? We're social workers. We're social workers dealing with social problems. People in the environment, people in the political, economical, structural environment.
Yes.
We need that structural racism lens. So take the Undoing Racism workshop.
Yep.
Insist that the CSWE embrace this understanding of structural racism. Talk to your professors. They should take an Undoing Racism workshop.
Yeah, please go to them workshops. It's so much to learn. I'm telling you, I'm 63 years old, guys, and I'm still learning. It feels good.
Feels good. I have to say in closing that I have never felt more human.
Just never.
In Undoing Racism, because if racism destroys humanity, undoing racism restores that humanity.
Yes, it does.
I am so grateful for this work.
Yes.
And I'm grateful, Meg, that you've invited us to be here today.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you, Sandy, for accepting me and teaching me that I'm willing to learn. I am learning, and I'm feeling great.
Wow. Well, the honor has truly been mine. I'm so thankful that both of you were willing to share and speak truth to power and share this information.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled that my students now are going to get to hear about this from what you shared. So, and also, you know, this is for technically a social welfare policy class, and I speak on a regular basis about how important it is for us as social workers to take action.
Yes.
And you are living examples of how we as social workers take action and move policies, shift policies to be more to be more informed by those who the policies are impacting.
Exactly.
So I have a feeling you'll be hearing more from me and my students.
Yes, and I don't know if anybody knows the students, but we have an advocacy day on March 13th on solitary confinement. So in Albany.
In 2018.
Yeah. So I think my students actually know about that. They're encouraged to attend, and they've got all the info. So maybe they'll see maybe they'll see you there, Margarita. Are you going to be there?
Yes, I hope so.
Okay.
I wanted to say one thing about what you, in closing. I know I could go on and on forever, but you know what? We have social work has siloed ourselves. Administration, clinical, case work, administration, community organizing. But really, the only thing that brings justice is community organizing. Community organizing has to be pulled through all the disciplines. The only thing that trumps, and excuse that expression, the only thing that trumps racism is organizing.
Mm-hmm.
This petition means nothing if it's just coming from one college. But we are a national network, right? And we have signatures from all over the nation. And whether you're organizing within your institution, within your church, your synagogue, your family, that we have to, our roots, we are organizers by our roots and our own history. And yet we've somehow been made to distance ourselves simply because nobody will pay for organizers anymore. But that's who we are. And we bring that to our clinical work.
That's right.
To our administrative work. And we bring that to policy. We can't do this alone. It's not a top-down job, right? It's top-down, inside out. We've got to do it together.
Yes, together, organizing.
Okay. Well, that's a perfect note, I feel like, to end on. What do you feel like, Margarita? Is that a good note?
Yes, I love it.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Margarita.
And
on that note, I'm going to stop the recording button, and we can do this again sometime soon.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.